and welcome to the news section of Plague Tapes 115, and it's been recorded around, well, no, not around, on the date of the 24th of November 2021, and I am joined, as always, by Andrew, who knows what's going on, and I'm here to ask the questions. In fact, Andrew, do you have a specific, is there some reference to you on Twitter, like there's an Andrew Flood position? It's like
narrative
was the word. The narrative is that you care too much about public health.
Probably, I don't know.
You're prepared to crash the economy.
I woke up to a notification with that in it the other morning, and
the Andrew
somebody
Flood
had
narrative.
done that. Is it Drake, the meme? The one was kind of looking in horror, and then, well, but anyway.
I don't know any of these memes. Like, sure, I'm not even on Instagram. I know nothing.
Yeah. Hardly use a dial-up phone.
My position of ignorance is, I feel like I play some part in the Andrew Flood narrative. Anyway, somebody told me there's like, what is our caseloads these days? 6,500 or something a day.
No, we're kind of so one of the things to say is it's actually pretty chaotic. It's jumping around a lot because
we're having difficulty measuring things.
Yeah, well, the testing system is capacity. I would say that also means the lab system is at capacity and the reporting system is at capacity. So it's kind of jumping between 3,200 and 5,950-ish between those points. But if you look at the swabs, we've had about 14 days. Actually, I was hoping to get today's before the show started, but I think we've had 13 days where the swabs have been 4,300, 4,400, pretty much every single day.
Well, we can be pretty sure that day 14 will probably be something similar.
Who knows?
It's unlikely to go down.
And positivity, strangely enough, has also been fairly constant. A little bit of movement between 14% and 16%. So the concern is that what that actually means is that, or what catching each time is 14% of test capacity, and that doesn't actually tell us how many cases there are out there. So for the last week, I've been kind of paying more attention to the number in hospital with COVID, because that's a kind of more definite number. And that is kind of actually somewhat optimistic over the last 2 to 3 days, in that it increased to a peak up around 680, I think, and now it's fallen back to about 608. But the interesting, well, the kind of somewhat hopeful stat is if you do a running average of how many people go to hospital every 7 days, which is typically, let me pull up, it's typically up around 600.
We're definitely sure about
515 yesterday, for instance. Right?
When you say like we're kind of sure, like surely we're sure about hospital.
So yeah, we're sure about how many people are in hospital and have COVID, right?
Right.
However, there's also a capacity issue at the hospitals, in that last night there was only 137 beds available, right? Out of, I think there's about 1,100 acute hospital beds, so that's about 1%, right? So with that crisis, it would be easy enough to imagine that they may have tightened up admissions for COVID slightly. So they might be slightly more inclined to go, you're sick, but you're not so sick, we need to put you in hospital, you can go home. Okay. Or they might be more inclined to go, oh, we think you're well enough to leave now, we don't need to wait until tomorrow, because they need those beds. So you can't really be sure that, say, 600 hospital cases now are the same as 600 hospital cases 2 months ago. That there will also be some, I suspect, issue around that.
So sorry, you just give me the 1,100. There's 1,100 beds basically for acute.
I think it's about 1,100.
And there was 130 what?
137 yesterday evening were available.
Okay.
So there's a load of, like, there were about 7 hospitals had no beds, and quite a few had, like, 2.
Right.
And of course, so and that's even more true of ICU, which I think is 132 today. And I mean, people remember that in the January wave that hit 220, 230, but it's different now because then we had a lockdown So, as I've said before, you don't have as many road traffic accidents thing. But they also shut down most of the healthcare, where they're trying to keep things running at the moment, which is kind of remarkable. So it means that ICU availability is very low indeed. So again, you can't really know if an increase in the fact that ICU doesn't increase by much is because there's not a demand for that, or because that demand does exist, but those people simply can't get into ICU and are being treated outside of it with high flow oxygen or whatever, Okay. So yeah, it's the problem when you've lots and lots of cases. Is that all the meaning of all the stats become less certain. I think of the three, the hospital one is probably the closest to actually telling us what's going on. So I mean, what that does suggest is that we might well have hit not necessarily a case plateau, certainly a very significant slowing down in the rate of growth of cases. And because the other things that are happening at the same time is there's the booster program is happening, so that's less. So that should mean fewer elderly people getting infected, and they get sent to hospital at a much higher percentage than anybody else. And also there's a weird counterintuitive effect where we're kind of at the point where immunity against infection is waning off for most of the younger population. So they're getting infected. However, we know that immunity against hospitalization lasts much longer than against infection, right? So you therefore have this counterintuitive thing where the actual percentage of cases getting hospitalized drops because of that. Because you're getting more cases but similar protection against hospitalization. I can see you looking puzzled, so you'll have to take my word for that one. And then the other thing is the percentage of cases in young children has gone up. The percentage of cases in over 65s to 85s have gone down. Right now, that last one I think is probably them being more careful and not going out. And not, again, the other one's most likely to go to hospital. So in other words, you've got all these different things that are going on. You've got testing at capacity, hospitals at capacity, ICU at capacity. That makes all those numbers uncertain. But then you have these additional forces acting in the background that would be pulling ratios around the place. So it basically means there isn't any way of looking at the stats at the moment and going, I think I know where we are. They're all a bit confused. That's the negative side. The positive side, however, is that although we obviously have the health system is obviously in crisis and obviously fairly miserable for anybody working in it, we haven't had the sort of rapid growth of ICU cases that we've seen in previous ways. That's what actually led to lockdowns. And if it is the case that hospital cases are topping out, it might be only 3 or 4 days of that apparent effect showing. We've had 2 false dips already since the start of October, so I don't want to overstate that. It might mean we end up either not needing a lockdown or it won't amount to a whole much. We'll kind of get to that in the next few days. Difficulty with that is the length of stay in ICU, of course, which people are in there for a long time. So that accumulates as well. So that's the other force. So that's where we are basically. We're
so my reading is we're at capacity everywhere.
Yeah.
And we have... Like, the takeaway is we might have hit a plateau, but we can't really be certain about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely been talked about. I mean, there's talk about on regime radio, they would all say, like, that's the talk.
Yeah, well, the raw case numbers make it look like we have. But as I said, the thing is that could be camouflaging an actual increase in the background. That's the problem. We wouldn't necessarily know. And one circumstance, for instance, that increase could be happening is if the rate of colds and RSV type viral infections and all those were increasing at a similar rate to COVID. So everybody with those symptoms is trying to get tested, and the same percentage is going to be coming back COVID every time because it's in proportion to those other things as well. So that's just one theoretical possibility in terms of why you might get a flat case rate and a flat positivity, because it's a weird combination we haven't really seen before. Normally one or the other is moving.
So anyway, to put a hole in that narrative, it might not be the case anyway, and given that everything is at capacity, it's very hard to work reliably on any of those figures that are coming through. There's too many factors going on. So so the lockdown scenario, right? We're back to everybody working from home if they can work from home. There definitely seems to be decrease in the numbers of people actually out and about. It feels pretty quiet out there. There's probably two factors at stake there. There's the people, which people have been constantly anticipating or listening, paying much more weight to whatever Neffet say than whatever our great leaders say. So that might be one aspect of it. But is there actual serious talk of a lockdown, or because I've heard that it's been kind of poo-pooed by like almost all the politicians. It's not getting support from any of the leaders.
Yeah, so, well, a couple of interesting things like that around that. One is the latest Timorak opinion poll had almost 2/3 of people wanting additional restrictions. So that happens before every lockdown. Basically, public opinion flips over because people get worried about case numbers and all the rest.
Yeah.
So that's one indication that I think is probably relevant, because that then changes the way politicians
because that's
feel
what
about
politicians always feel. It's
yeah.
always a finger in the wind.
Neffet, I think today or last night, was saying that they don't think they're not going to issue advice for additional restrictions this week, right? So in other words, I think they're probably looking at exactly the same stats I'm looking at and going, ooh.
We can't really say.
What does that actually mean? And I think in the background is not a plan, but an acceptance that of people getting infected, because that builds population immunity and reduces the size of potential future pressure on hospitalisation. So, I think the fact that there's probably a sense that they've maxed out dose 1, dose 2 vaccination. The booster program is now rolling out. It'll probably get to most people over 50 by kind of mid-January or so, I would guess. And then you have that, 5-6% of adults who don't want to be vaccinated and probably won't want to be at this stage. And I think if you look at the number of unvaccinated people who've gone into the ICU since June, which is about 380 people or so, and you consider that when you calculate the ICU demand from the unvaccinated adults, that would come out at about 1,000 people, which would suggest that maybe about 1/3 of unvaccinated adults have now been infected. I mean, that's a ballpark figure, right? It's a fairly crude calculation, but it would suggest it's, say, between 1/4 and 1/2 or something like that. And that leaves about 500 to 600 potential unvaccinated ICU cases, which, if you could spread that out evenly into 50 a month, would probably be manageable, maybe even 100 a month. But of course, the problem with COVID is it doesn't come in little packets; it comes in waves. So there's the remaining potential for a lockdown now, if enough of those people get infected over the next couple of weeks to create a crisis. And if that doesn't happen, and instead the cases go down again, well then, February, say for instance, there's the potential for another wave. And again, if you have 600 people being put in ICU over quite a narrow period of time, that would create a crisis in itself. But there is, at the same time, there's a sense from that, Matt, that actually that might be it. And that's where we need to talk about waning immunity. But in terms of at least the immediate assumptions about immunity people were working off, then got to a high enough level of population immunity that you would then just be dealing with the cost of endemic COVID, which is fairly substantial. I mean, I think I've said before, it looks like it's about one person needing ICU per 1,000 in the initial infection, even post-vaccination, which is quite high.
Okay, so when you say that would look like that would be about it, are we talking about a wave in February, or are we talking about a wave now, as in this wave?
No, well, there's two. So there's a couple of possibilities. Like, one is, if you remember the recent Neffet scenarios where they were talking about 400 people needing to go into ICU at the peak of this current wave, right? Okay. As the pessimistic scenario, and I think the optimistic was around 200, right? So in that pessimistic one, what that is essentially based off is that all those unvaccinated people get infected, almost all of them, So most of that pent up ICU demand, which, as I said, I think is probably about 600 people left or whatever, all comes through at the same time. And then you get about the same number again of people who've been vaccinated, but there's vaccine breakthrough infections.
Yeah.
So that's what the NEFID pessimistic scenario kind of looks like, right? And then the optimistic scenario is assuming that actually more of them have already been exposed to COVID and therefore have some level of immunity. So both those, like the reason both those scenarios peaked in late around now actually, or a little bit further into December in the next 2 weeks, was that assumption that, okay, that's pretty much everybody at this stage has either been vaccinated or will have had COVID once, and then that will therefore reduce the size of future peaks and cause a trough in this one.
Yeah. But since we haven't hit 200 in ICUs yet, does that mean we're still on the way?
No, as I said, my calculation is there's still 600 people on the unvaccinated who are likely to need ICU.
Yeah.
You know, call it 400 to 800. You know, like it's somewhere in that region.
Okay, but what I'm trying to get a picture of now is like we're at 132 in ICU at the moment, right? And that's. So, are we on trajectory to hit 200, or are they expecting that 200 is where what we can deal with?
So again, no. You see, this is the thing. That, as I said, it's 200 people who need it. That doesn't mean they can get into it, right?
Okay.
And so, like in the pessimistic, it's 400 people who need it, but we only have 300 ICU beds. So by definition, you can't have 400.
That is pretty pessimistic,
space,
all right? Yeah, that's 100 people outside the system.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, to be honest, 132 today is causing a major pressure on other healthcare. I think the hospitals are about to go into surge capacity, which means that they basically shut down doing other operations and they use the operating theatres as ICUs. The last HSE press conference, they sort of said that they've given a circular to the hospital saying they can do that when they need to, and that each individual hospital will then be making its own decisions on it. But actually, because of the way people are transferred between hospitals, that, you know, in effect, they'll go over like dominoes once the first couple go.
But also, if you have 7 hospitals that currently have no capacity,
yeah,
I mean,
well, it was more. That was
like
seven of no acute beds. The day before
right.
yesterday, 17 out of the 26 acute hospitals had no ICU beds. So
yeah, so like I mean that feels very much like capacity.
Yeah,
has already been reached.
Well, but
and then we also heard about wasn't there a transplant operation that got
there was
cancelled?
a liver transplant cancelled in one of the hospitals recently as well. Yeah, so because there was no ICU bed available. So
exactly, so that feels like they've definitely hit capacity in that, and that which kind of brings us back to the point about what additional measures. So people want additional measures. The government, as usual, are reluctant to give additional measures. The NEFID are saying, let's wait a week.
Mm-hmm.
We could actually ask for additional measures. But then, and there's talk of this lockdown being like what we used to call, or what they call the circuit breaker, right? So would that have like an impact in terms of like, I mean, when they say a lockdown, like I just trying to work out what kind of lockdown this would look like. Would it be a lockdown where we're supposed to work from home or whatever, but the pubs are still open and we can still go to a football match? I mean, I'm trying to work out what kind of lockdown are we talking about, and what is the capacity of that to alleviate some of the stress in terms of the capacities that the system is hitting now.
So the tricky thing with this, so the big danger is that people who are going in need of ICU today will probably have been infected about the start of this month, right? Somewhere around there, the 1st or 2nd of November, right? Which means that if today you did something to try and protect ICU, some sort of lockdown, whatever you want to call that,
right. Now
people would still be going into ICU until, about the 14th of December or so.
Yeah.
And in fact, because it takes people longer to come out, that it would continue to climb for longer than that, right? So from that point of view, it's obvious we're already in a very precarious position. And what they're betting on is that the rate of new admissions to ICU will remain relatively low compared to deaths and discharges, right? Which has kind of been what's happening over the last while.
Right.
So that maybe you've 12 people going in, you've 6 people coming out, and you've 4 people dying, so it only goes up 2. That basically is what happens between yesterday and today, for instance, right? So that's one end of the maths. Now, that's an important thing because that's very different from the previous waves and the lockdowns they generated. Because what was happening in the previous waves is that the demand for ICU was doubling every 3 to 6 days or whatever, depending on which way you're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
At the moment, we're probably talking about a doubling that's 4 weeks long or something like that. So
it is pretty much
very
because if
different
we
beast.
look at we did a show I think it was 113, and we were looking at ICU demand around 63, and we're now at 132. So that's definitely almost a month away. And
Yeah.
so that's a doubling. So we're at 132. So it makes sense that it's taken that length of time. But what you're saying effectively is whatever they bring in now, probably we wouldn't feel the effects of it until after Christmas.
Yeah, well, so
in terms of from a health perspective, or ICU perspective.
I'm trying to, it's like, so when you're talking about whether or not there needs to be lockdown, when it will happen and all that, it's important to think, well, when will the actual crisis happen? Because you can't wait for the crisis to arrive and do it, because that you've got 3 weeks growth built in.
Yeah.
So you're kind of making a bet on what the speed of that growth is and everything else, right? And that's why it matters that it's quite hard to actually know what the hell's going on, because everything's at capacity.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to make decisions on information that is extremely muddy. So that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is definitely government policy, and even efforts seem to as well are going with, okay, let's keep things open and try and keep case growth and hospital growth low enough that the a 3 week lag basically between action and effect won't amount to all that many extra cases. It might be a doubling, or not even a doubling. Might be a 60% increase or whatever. Because that way, at least the people who won't get vaccinated, they're pretty brutal if you put the logic this way. That way, at least a big chunk of the people who won't get vaccinated are getting infected and mostly surviving, and therefore have some immunity that will make the next wave easier to handle. Because the bet is that, as within vaccination, that if you're infected and you recover it, you're less likely to need to go to hospital or whatever on a second infection. That's
okay.
A little bit uncertain, but of course, you do know that if 1 to 2% of those infected die, well, obviously that's 1 to 2% of the most vulnerable removed from the equation second round round. So there's a kind of brutal logic to what you're actually pushing through with this, and then over time it becomes manageable. And I think it probably is true if say that it turns out we're at the peak of this wave, and if it diminishes, right, and if we avoid a new wave until say March, when the weather starts to come around to being on our side again, then probably you're talking about a very long period going way into next autumn without any significant restrictions being needed, presuming no immune evading variants or whatever turn around.
Okay, right.
And then
all that idea.
and then we've a problem to deal with next winter because immunity has waned and all those other things. But,
but now this is interesting because it feels like we're now trying to deal with or trying to implement public health policy on the basis of an ever smaller number of people that are, for one reason or another, not vaccinated and not likely to get vaccinated. Is that right? It feels pretty selfish that we've got this 6% of the population that have us living through this nightmare because of their refusal to. I mean, I know I start sounding like a shock jock now. But it's all being determined by this group. I mean, also the other factor obviously is the 5 to 12-year-olds who are all just happily running around in the playgrounds and infecting the living daylights out of each other, but also infecting the teachers, and then the teachers are also, I mean, rightly not happy about that, and then that there is those breakthrough infections that we'll get eventually, because we're coming into Christmas, we'll get to the more vulnerable population. But leaving that aside, let's take the kids out of it. We are really trying to. We have a whole perspective now, which is all about dealing with the 6%.
Yeah, and so that calculation I was talking about, how many unvaccinated eligible people have probably not been infected so far, right?
Yeah.
My ballpark estimate of that is it's about 200,000 people. Right. And actually, don't forget that's everybody over the age of 12. Yeah. So the adult end of that is going to be smaller again. Might be 120,000, something like that. So it's actually not a very big pool of people at all at this stage anymore. Yeah. But the problem is if half of ICU beds are taken up by people
or
from
66%, wasn't it? Is it
yeah.
2/3.
I mean, I'm expecting that to go down towards, probably towards half, maybe even a bit under half as we go through. But yes, that's the problem. Like that's the if all those people were vaccinated, then 95% of those wouldn't need ICU, and the potential ICU demand would drop from 600 to 30. Yeah. Right. Which, as I said, I think even with everybody vaccinated, there would still be challenges to this. But there's a very disproportionate impact from a relatively small group of people at this stage.
Okay, and sorry, and so therefore we're this talk about a circuit breaker or whatever, that's unlikely to happen then, is it? Or because we wouldn't really see the benefits of that until post Christmas.
So I think an awful lot of this is just people speculating and rumour mills, and there's lots of stuff going on with it. Right. So I suspect one of the reasons people are talking about a circuit breaker is there'd be a certain logic, right? You get to the start of December, or the first week of December, and you have, say, a 2 to 3 week lockdown until the 20th of December, right? And you hope by doing that you're getting your cases down from 4,000 a day to about maybe 1,200 a day would be possible, right? Something in that region, 1,400 a day, which means you then go into Christmas and everybody meeting up with a much smaller base of actively infectious people. So you've less.
We're driving down the incidence. That's what we're.
So you've less Christmas dinners that end up with disaster, basically. So I suspect that's why people are talking about that, because there's a sort of logic to it. But I think I would say it's also very possible from the public health perspective that that actually wouldn't be a great idea, because that would still be a huge amount of cases. Remember, we went into Christmas last year with 300, so going in with 1,200 would be 4 times that. And people could just go into Christmas then with a false sense of security and take risks that they shouldn't be taking.
Yeah, whereas when you were saying this thing about maybe a 3-week lockdown, and then we emerge from the lockdown on the 20th. Can you imagine what the 20th is going to look like?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh my God.
You basically, what you want to do is emerge less than one infection cycle before Christmas Day. Yeah. So 22nd is probably a better date.
But either way, everyone goes on the tear. That's what I'd be worried about. Yeah.
But you can see, you sort of see why theoretically some people are looking at this and going, oh, maybe this is the plan. But I don't think so, because I think that would still be an awful lot of cases. It mightn't work very well. It mightn't be very good. People mightn't follow it very well. And you could have a bit of a false sense of security, where there may be the idea that if we are plateauing with cases or slowing down, and we go into the Christmas period with a still very consistently high period of cases, therefore people will be quite careful around Christmas this year. etc. I mean, it's like many other areas.
A whole what if.
It's very hard to see what the hell the right answer to something like that would be, because there isn't one.
Yeah.
But I definitely don't think that we are automatically heading into a lockdown. It very much depends on what the stats are over the next week, basically.
And the difficulty then, as well, is if we've hit capacity everywhere, how reliable are the stats?
Yeah, that's exactly.
So, okay, so talk to me about incidence level, because we must be where are we in
it's something ridiculous, like 1,400, I think.
Because I'm looking at reading about other countries, and it's there's kind of all kinds of emergency measures coming into place in Germany, and it's at 100 or 104, and I'm kind of going, that's nothing. What are you talking about? And so
1269 as of yesterday. That's what it was. So 1269. Yeah. So okay. So well, we're about 10th in Europe, I think, in terms of incidence level. In fact, but mostly because several Eastern European countries are getting hit much harder. But yes, you're right. Like countries like Germany who actually got lower incidence than us, but are taking action. Austria, same sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
The reason for that, though, is they have a much smaller fraction of their population vaccinated. They have a much bigger problem with vaccine hesitancy, which means for the same level of cases, they have a much bigger ICU demand, right, than we do. So the vaccination is basically why we didn't go into lockdown 2 to 3 months ago, because that would have been what we would have had to do. Instead, we've had this, and it feels completely weird, long situation of, I mean, if we go back to July of 2020, and we were having 6 cases a day, 8 cases a day, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And we were sort of going into August and being a bit worried because that had gone up to 100.
I know, that's why this feels very strange.
Yeah, and now we're kind of going, oh yeah, it's 4,000 today, 5,900 yesterday, 3,800 the day before, and people are both alarmed but also somewhat casual about it. And the only reason that's happening is because so many people are vaccinated. So it's reduced the cost, in other words.
Yeah. But in terms of the booster rollout then, I mean, is there, like you were saying last week when you were on, it was that there's a possibility that the booster would be the final, like it would be a kind of like the silver bullet or the final shot that you'd need in order to...
Yeah, so, well, there are 2 categories of people, right? I think there's some realistic hope that basically this will turn out to be a 3-dose vaccine.
Yeah.
Or, alternatively, a vaccine with 2 doses but 6 months apart, basically. In that, the sort of early data from Israel, which obviously got boosters out faster, is that waning is much slower against severe outcomes, right?
Okay.
There's going to be the infection problem. We're not going to get over that. This is why there will be a significant cost. But if you can cut the severe outcome cost from 95% to 97%, then you're cutting 1,000 deaths to 500 sort of thing. So that has a big outcome. And it's kind of like that. It looks like that might be the case. We don't know yet because not enough time has passed, right? So, I mean, that's what the idea of a 3-dose vaccine thing would be. However, there's another population of people who just can't mount a good immune response because they're immunocompromised, they're elderly, whatever else. So that population might well end up needing to be given an additional dose every 6 months or so, like that.
Okay.
I would not be overly surprised if that turns out to be the case. They're the scenarios, and it could turn out that actually maybe everybody over 50 needs to get that. I mean, we'll get, like, we'd expect the severe outcome by age data to be very different, and possibly, sort of 60, 65 is when your immune system starts to get a lot weaker. So that's the most likely cutoff point. But we'll see. We won't. There's no real way of knowing this, in other words, until time has passed and
we'll all still
there's
be
enough
working
data.
anyway.
Yeah.
Work until we're in our graves. Great, because we can't retire until we're 68.
Dealing with the pensions time bomb.
Well, this might be a way.
Well,
there are people who are saying this is a way to deal with the pensions time bomb.
Yeah.
Somebody came up with it.
Getting COVID every year now, from 50 to 70 would probably cut down life expectancy a fair bit. So.
We should not laugh.
Yeah,
we should not
that's
laugh.
us. That's us. We're
That's
on the
us.
firing
Yeah,
line on that.
We're there. Okay, so again, like it seems like the update is that we think we might have hit a peak, but we don't know if we're going to hit a peak, and we're probably not likely to know that until we get some of this.
No, the thing is, you never know you've hit a peak until afterwards.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, like
that's the thing.
But so. This is a good question because, I feel like it is because we basically we can only predict this. There's no way you can predict this without actually going through it. So basically we'll only know the peak afterwards. Yeah. But how do you know it's going in the right direction if you have capacity across all the testing systems. It's like, so we have, like, there's reports of something like 10 counties that have no
It's
PCR
all of them
kits.
essentially. It's all of them at the moment.
Yeah, so,
like I was just looking at people saying they couldn't book tests for the day after tomorrow at the moment, right?
Yeah, and we've heard of other people who got the last PCR test in Dublin.
Yeah.
2 days ago or 3 days ago, or whatever. So,
I mean, we've one friend who's tested positive on multiple antigen tests, but doesn't have a car, so hasn't been able to. I presume this is the issue. You can't get to any of the testing centres where there is availability. So, there's going to be a fairly sizable contingent of people not getting PCR tested in this current context.
So so we've hit that, and the incidence that we think is out there is what, 1,012. 1,000. It's astronomical, but the actual real life incidence is probably far greater than that. And at what point will we get to a situation where we'll know, like, when we get back to having enough kits to test everybody and everything else, then the surge will more than likely it'll have passed.
So the thing that will tell us it's passing, is
that's what I'm
the
asking,
test positivity will fall, right?
Right.
It's plateaued along with the swab numbers at about 14%, 14 to 16%, moving around a bit. That's day-to-day movement. So if that falls back to say 9%, even if we're still getting about 4,000 positives a day, you'd be going, okay, that probably indicates that we have now passed.
So even if we're not testing everybody that needs to be tested, at least the positivity will give us some indication that it might have passed.
I mean, there is an outside possibility that actually that could also happen if other symptom-causing things were growing much faster than COVID. And then the proportion of COVID undetected in symptomatic people will be decreasing, even if it was increasing in the population. But leaving that aside, that's the.
I see what you mean. Okay, yeah. So you get something, you think it's COVID, you test it, and whatever the antigen test says, you go down, you get a PCR test, and then it turns out it's not detected. But but like there could still be lots of people out there asymptomatic, and then also have it.
Well, so if you imagine that today there are 10,000 people with RSV, and there are 5,000 people with COVID, right?
Yeah.
And so they all go and they all have similar symptoms. They get tested. So a third of your results are COVID, and 2/3 are RSV, right?
Yeah.
But you only have 30,000 tests, so you get back 10,000 COVID and 20,000 RSV, right? Yeah. Okay, and then this day next week, RSV has increased from 20,000 cases to 50,000 cases, and COVID has increased from 10,000 to 14,000, right? Yeah. But because it's now 50,000 RSV to 14,000 COVID,
it's not going to be reflected.
COVID will have appeared to have shrunk, even though it's actually bigger. So that just theoretically, that's one way you could, even with positivity, you could be caught out in it.
Okay.
Right. I'm not saying that is what's happening. It's just that's the problem when you just have a lot of uncertainty around it.
So at what point in time in the future do you think we'll have a clearer idea? I mean,
well, the hospital numbers are key,
capacity
right?
Back in terms of
I think the hospital numbers are the ones to watch, because that went up to 680 over the weekend. Weekend is always a high point anyway. Monday morning figure tends to be the highest. Is now back around, I think, 610. So if that falls and goes back to say 550, 500, then you can be pretty sure that either cases have also fallen, or that actually cases aren't that as important as an indicator as they were previously. Either of those answers are just fine. Like if it's actually the case that due to boosters or whatever other reason, cases don't hospitalise people as often as they have up to now, then we don't need to worry about cases as much as we did previously. If that weakens,
because you're dealing with severe outcomes.
The ideal, if you accepting COVID becoming endemic, the whole thing, your ideal outcome with that is that everybody gets COVID, but it doesn't matter. It's just a common cold, right? And we've talked about this in previous shows. The problem is at the moment it looks like the cost of that is still very substantial, at least to a couple of first time infected, second time infected type things. So that's the problem with that plan. But if it was the case that vaccination turned COVID into a common cold, well then we wouldn't bother counting cases anymore, because we don't count common cold cases.
Sure. Okay, and then one other thing that struck me was I thought we had kind of ICU capacity at something like 300 beds or something. But
Yes, yeah.
But we have 680 people now?
No. That's the hospital figure. There was 680 in hospital, not in ICU.
Oh, right.
Of that,
hospital.
132 in ICU.
Oh, right. Okay, 680 with COVID. That's
Yes.
the 680. Okay, right. Sorry. Okay. So 200 is still the case in terms of...
No, there is the ICU capacity
or
has
the
been
surge
expanded
capacity, is it?
to I think 296 units.
Okay.
And then they can do a surge capacity because surge capacity basically involves shutting down other care. So
Yeah.
both because you need, say, the operating theatre as physical space, but also because you need the staff
Yeah.
to redeploy to ICU. So obviously you're not going to do that until you have to, right?
Okay.
When
it's not an ideal situation.
when they
yeah.
had to do it last January, I think it maxed out at 324.
Okay.
I think they said they could go to 330 was what they reckoned.
Right.
So that's your kind of absolute last desperate measure.
Okay.
Basically, is that's what you would do.
Okay, so let's play just suppose.
And of that, 220 or 230 were COVID, because you're going to have 100 other people with heart attacks,
Yes,
strokes, whatever
yeah,
else.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and also if everything is going as normal, you're
Yeah.
going to have more of that.
yeah.
So let's play the just supposing game. So just supposing it was. We are going through the peak now. That this is the peak, and there's a plateauing effect. When could we expect to start seeing indicators come back online? Like, as in, testing capacity and everything else. Like, when will things drop to a level, or when will it be a week? Will it be 2 weeks? How much?
So let me put it this way:
Yeah.
so the last two or 3 days, we have seen what might be a hospital peak.
Yeah,
Might not. It's only 3 days, so it could just dip and go back up
that's
again. Right?
yeah. It's not long enough time. Right.
But if you imagine, if that actually reflects reality, right,
Yeah.
then that is infections 2 weeks ago, right? So it means 2 weeks ago, fewer people started to get infected, and now so fewer people need to go to hospital.
Okay.
That would be it. And so that would mean that about 3 or 4 days ago, you would have expected cases to have been peaking, right? Now, the thing is, if, as we suspect, that actually our ability to measure cases meant they were higher than they previously been, so they went above that capacity line.
Yeah.
And then
We
maybe
couldn't
they're
move
coming
them.
back down towards it at the moment, right?
Yeah.
So what we might expect, if that current hospitalisation peak is actually a peak, is actually real, is towards the weekend we might see positivity starting to fall from 14% to 13% to 12% to, I'd say if it gets down to, say, 10%, I'd then be confident that's something real has actually happened there, right? I mean, if it just falls 1%,
As
it's a
opposed to
bit
a blip.
meaningless.
Yeah.
And also hospitalisation would need to continue to fall in the meantime. It will go up slightly at the weekend, but that we'd expect to see that. And then also at the weekend, we would expect to see the number of new people going into ICU also starting to fall. Now, because that's a small number, it's very noisy anyway.
Right.
But so you'd basically expect to see more or less that sort of sequence. And
Okay.
by next Wednesday, we might be seeing a fall from that 4,400 cases a day to 4,200, 4,100, whatever, that idea of a downward trend, right?
Yeah.
So if all that has happened 2 weeks ago, right, which is not unreasonable because we know people's behaviours changed 2 weeks ago, right? Whether or not it's enough is another question. Then we'd see that. Now, we'll also have the work from home stuff, which started just at the end of the last weekend.
That was kind of last Thursday.
All that
really,
sort of thing.
officially.
That may also have an added impact in there.
I think people preempted that, though. I think people
Yeah,
started going.
that's my impression too.
Yeah.
Like, if people, once they sort of said that was going to happen, I think people who were in
People
position to
started
do
doing
it did
it,
it. So all those. So we might, in other words, this time next week, we might have a much more definite picture
Okay.
than we do now.
It feels like every week we come on, we like kind of go, oh yeah, things are bad, but we're not really sure. It's been very hard to predict what the trajectory is.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a continuing issue.
Well, it looked pretty terrible 3 to 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And we are definitely no longer on that trajectory.
Yeah.
Like, that's the one thing absolutely 100% sure certain we're not on the trajectory where basically around the end of October, the start of November, when it was really very alarming, right? what we don't know at the moment is if we're still going up slightly, which means we're going to get in trouble, whether we've got a plateau, which will help, but will still get us in trouble, or we've peaked and maybe we won't get in trouble, but it's a bit, even that is a bit dicey just because of the slow release of people from ICU in comparison to people. Like, I don't think there's a scenario in which most other healthcare that needs ICU stays operational over the Christmas period. I think that's gone. Like that will be going over the next week to 10 days. That and I mean that actually used to happen in the old days with flu, generally in January. Or you'd lose some capacity, you wouldn't lose all of it. So, but I think that realistically, I don't think any of the three scenarios of what might be happening get us out of that problem. That's built in. We've got too many cases. In the system as it is.
So I'm trying to, because everything just blends from one week into the next. So I'm trying to remember 2 weeks back. What was that? Where were we in terms of? I remember we had the nightclubs opening up when was that? Wasn't that?
They were open for a week, were they?
No, it was.
No, that was October. Was that middle of October or something?
So that was middle of October. It's like,
was that actually? No, I think that was before.
Was it start of October?
No, it was before the Halloween weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I think so. It was so that they could take advantage of that. So that's now quite a long time ago, but they went open for very long.
Yeah, but then we were at that idea that, like, from day one when that happened, we thought this is a bad idea, and then 2 weeks later we were kind of going, it was definitely a bad idea. And then it was like, I think it was another week after that we were kind of going, oh, like, they've totally lost the run of themselves. What are they going to do? Like, so people were talking about what are they going to do from about 4 weeks ago, and then it took them another 2 weeks to actually say you should work from home.
Well, I went back to my...
again, like, it must be,
I went back to my Twitter feed, and actually it became obvious to me we were in trouble on October the 7th and the 8th, and definite by the 11th, right? And that's before the nightclubs open, by the way. At that rate...
even then we thought it was a bad idea.
Yeah, you could see cases were starting to take off in a way that would get us into trouble in a month or two, depending on what rate that actually was.
Right.
And I did that... I can't remember I did that. That was on Cork,
excuse me.
Cork Local Radio, 98 FM, whatever it's called down there. Yeah. I think I said that on that as well, that we're obviously getting into trouble, but it would be 2 to 3 weeks at least before any decisions would have to be made because of pressures, right? I thought they would actually shut stuff down earlier, like at a lower ICU number. But that's basically where we've been going. So that's
okay.
They basically, like, the strategy does seem to have been to kind of play chicken with COVID and with the general population. Like, there's a certain part of the strategy is just about scaring the population into behaving. So we're not going to shut things down.
Talk about personal responsibility.
Yeah, a lot of that's what it translates.
We're going to keep things open.
Yeah.
And then it's up to you to look after yourself.
Yeah.
Even though there's no repercussions, there's no real checking, there's no, like, we're having the conversations about ventilation and air purifiers and everything else. None of that. It's just it's on you.
Yeah, like this wave around, I ended up cancelling stuff I was going to be going to, because I was just like, okay, it's now become too dodgy. It wasn't that it got shut down and I couldn't go.
But like, you see, this is also kind of part of, I think that's also reflected in that poll where people are kind of going, like, I think, where you were saying that people wanted additional measures, right? A substantial proportion of the Morag poll said they wanted additional restrictions. I think that's kind of reaction to just make a decision. Just don't make it like I have to make a decision every time I step outside the door. I have to decide, is this worth the risk? And then people have all that responsibility on their shoulders of, like, taking all that risk and then possibly getting infected and then passing it on to somebody else. Like, they're kind of going, just tell me what it is that, like, you should do, so it's...
And I think what you get, as people start to cancel plans and stuff, right, and think it's too dangerous, they then get resentful of other people who continue to do stuff.
Well, that's true,
So it's one of the other problems with the kind of personal behaviour narrative is that it's inevitably much more divisive than saying we're all going to do something together, and the same rules are going to apply to all of us, So in fact, I mean, like, there was a funny thing on where, whatever, that football match a couple of weeks ago, was it on against Portugal?
Yes, there was.
Sports ball,
there was there was like, but there was one weekend where there was like, I think 2 games in a row with like 50,000.
Anyway,
every
yeah,
night, yeah.
Whatever.
Down in Lansdowne
yeah,
Road.
So there was the usual thing of being like the VIP box and people being at it. There was a photograph of Paul Reed, who had been on at the HSE press conference the day before, pleading with people to cut their social contacts, all the rest. Being someone that was obviously indoors, in a hall with loads of other people, chatting to people. Nobody's wearing masks except the people serving sandwiches or alcohol or whatever else. Because everybody's like, what the... And of course, I mean, so like it's very different from Golfgate, where what they were actually doing was definitely not allowed, even though... Did they rewrite the rules after for that one? No, they didn't.
No,
That's
they
the one
broke
they didn't.
the rules.
They decided they had broken the rules for that one. It was Leo's one that they rewrote the rules for. But it did it, like there was that other thing. Everybody in the VIP boxes, they were doing what they were allowed to do, but it was kind of the opposite of what they'd been telling us we should do a couple of days beforehand. So that kind of obviously pisses off a lot of people.
Yeah, but you see, but also it's the transition from we're all in this together to now everything's open, so make up your own mind.
Yeah, and actually,
it doesn't feel like we're in it together.
Another aspect we should touch on that is the controversy of the last few days, yet again, over antigen testing, right?
Right. Okay.
And specifically over when your testing system is at capacity, but more to the point, if your plan is to allow things to be open and people to go to things, then that automatically means the demand for testing is going to greatly increase, right? And if you're not going to do Denmark is about 5 times our PCR testing capacity, then you have to look at other routes for testing. So antigen testing is one obvious one, right? But of course, they're kind of like, they're nervous. I'm legitimately nervous about it in terms of if people use that as a green light to say I can do stuff, that they'll have a cold and take an antigen test and it'll be negative, so they'll decide they can't do it. But then the accuracy of the test isn't really enough to make that safe, because they're going to be wrong some of the time, right? But anyway, like if your setup is going to be that all this stuff's going to be open, people can do it, but we still need to keep a lid on cases somehow, then an obvious way of doing that is that people would test themselves, and particularly test themselves, I think, after events. I think people don't get this. It's not, like, I definitely think the idea that antigen tests can make a nightclub safe is ludicrous. That's just completely rubbish.
Yeah.
People won't be, not everybody will test themselves. Some people will cheat in the test because they want to go, blah, blah, blah. That's going to happen. It can't make that safe. What it can probably do, though, is in the week afterwards, or the 2 weeks afterwards, when the people who've been at the nightclub are maybe going to work or visiting elderly relatives or whatever else, they can test themselves in that context. Most easy to understand the context of visiting relatives, because there's no penalty involved if you test positive to go, okay, well, I'm going to cancel this. Works a bit more complicated. But so that's where a deployment would make sense. But the problem is,
so it's basically after you've taken the risk, you come back and then you say, oh, actually that didn't work out, and then you adjust your behavior appropriately.
Exactly, right. So here's the problem. They're not, as I said, they're not wonderfully accurate in the hands of consumers. And also, you test positive for a relatively brief window with them. Now, some people think that brief window coincides with the period when you're infectious, and other people go, by people here I'm talking about experts, I go, the evidence for that it's definitely not conclusive. So that's one issue. But what that basically means is, so you take the risk, and then what you want to do afterwards is not just take one test, but take a number of tests over a few days, right? So I have a friend who kind of flew somewhere for the weekend and came back, and I was talking about it. And the problem is, to be effective, fly somewhere on a Friday, you come back on the Monday, say. So what you really want to do is take your first test 3 to 4 days after that first flight. So basically you return on the Monday or Tuesday, you do it. And then you want the last test to be maybe 10 to 12 days after the last flight on the Monday, so that's into next week, into next Wednesday or Thursday. And then ideally you would test yourself every second day at least in between, so that's about 5 or 6 tests you need, right?
It's about 35-40 euros.
Well, exactly. So that's the problem at the moment. That's prohibitively expensive, right? So lots of people aren't going to be able to do that, and lots of other people just will be like, well, I can't do, if I do that, that means I can't go out at the weekend or whatever. So there'll be all those sort of things. That makes that much less likely. So there's the idea that okay, so we subsidise these tests to make them cheap. So like if you could get a pack of 5 tests for a £5, probably a lot more people would have done it. You know, if you could get 10 tests for a £5, probably everybody might do that.
Yeah.
You know, but there's been this big sort of pushback that they don't want to do that on the grounds that will increase risk. That doesn't really make sense because the risk is already there, right? This is not like last June when the airlines wanted to prematurely allow people flying on the basis of green light testing or something. This is, hey, people are taking the risks, they're allowed to take the risks, and what you want to do is reduce the risk of them infecting other people after that.
Yeah.
And what's the most effective way of doing that? And the most effective way is for them to test themselves multiple times. Because if the accuracy isn't great on one test, it's much better over 3.
Yeah.
5 tests, you know, you're much more likely to pick up a positive. But there's a big resistance to doing that. So that's one of the least thought out things, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, like the main thing I think, and I might have said this at the last show, the main problem with the current wave is it was foreseeable, it was predicted, and they made no preparation for it, really. You know, it was completely foreseeable we were going to hit test capacity, you know, and that's been foreseeable for weeks, but it seemed to catch them by surprise. You know, it happens now, and suddenly they're scrambling around and trying to get some extra testing and stuff. And you go, but lads,
it was going up. It was going up. I mean, how long does that have to
I could have told you
that
the 7th or 8th of October, listen, in 2 months' time, you're going to need more testing capacity. So there was no preparation for it. So with the antigen testing, that they've been caught completely on the hop, even though the need for it was obvious. So they're now trying to work out: are they going to subsidise them? What's the good instructions to give people? All this sort of stuff. That all should have been done like 2 months ago, so it was ready to roll out.
But also, like, do you remember we come from a time, and it's not that long ago, when they actually stepped down all the, like, at least they didn't do that. Which is
no, they had actually stepped down stuff.
Oh, had they stepped down stuff as well?
Because they're trying to recruit swabbers at the moment as well. No, they hadn't done the disastrous big step down they did back in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, I remember it was like like they just diminished all the capacity, took the structure down. So they did step down as well. Wow.
Yeah, there was some stuff going, and same with the vaccination stuff. Some stuff went, because I saw people saying that they were getting calls desperately trying to rehire them or whatever, and they were given out because they were looking for people's leaving cert results again. This was a big controversy with the first time around with the vaccination, that they wanted, you know, like, so you had people who were qualified nurses, because you had to be, in order to be a vaccinator, you know, it's not, I couldn't walk in and become one.
Yeah.
I had to actually, you know, have a medical qualification.
Yeah.
But then to employ people, they were saying, well, we want your leaving cert. You know, and people are going, what the hell do you need my leaving cert for?
A qualified nurse.
So now it turns out that the people that they let go from the vaccination program and that they now want to come back to give the booster shots are being told they have to provide their leaving cert again. And they're like, oh, for fuck's sake.
Oh my God, that's madness. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. I didn't realise that they'd actually stepped down capacity as well, when there's an obvious trajectory that it was going in and a direction that it's going in. Although I have to say, it doesn't also surprise me very much.
Yeah, I don't think it was a huge step down, but there was definitely fewer test centres than there were. Like,
but there's just this consistent pattern of bungling along, basically. Into
well, I presume it's resource constrained in part. Like, there's particular budgets. Yeah. You know, like, I mean, you keep getting people giving out about the HSE not creating more ICU beds.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're not creating ICU beds out of the change you find in the vending machine or something. That's a massively expensive program. That has to come from government funding. Yeah. And probably, I don't know exactly how HSE funding works,
also it comes
but I'd imagine that funding gets allocated. You know, so you can't actually take the vending machine money and move it over anyway.
Training of staff. And
there's a time thing as well.
And all the upskilling that's required, all that stuff. So it's not about the beds themselves, but it's about the staff and investing. Yes. So, and we still seem to be learning lessons in relation to that. Okay, so we come back next week and we might have a clearer picture.
We might know where we're going then. Hopefully it'll be good news.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Hi.
Thanks for that, Andrew.